Sounds like you're recording.
Yep.
Okay, it says, and I see your screen, Louise.
Shoot, I did it backwards. Okay, can I switch this? Dang it. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you're on full screen. You can shrink your screen if you want.
Set. So what are you seeing? Do you see a combine or do you see the PowerPoint?
I see your UBI slide, 1948.
Perfect, good. Then I'm in the right spot.
Okay, I think most people are in. So hello everyone, welcome to this webinar on World Para-Athletic Throws. We're honored to have Jerry Clayton and Louise Busquets to present to us about World Para-Athletics. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat or put them in. There's a Q&A function in Zoom, so if you just press on that, we can answer your questions then. And then, yeah, if there isn't anything else, I'll hand it over to you, Louise, to take it away.
Okay. The way that I do my screen sharing, I don't have access to that chat. So if there's something that you figure we need to stop for as we go along, that's fine. Otherwise, we'll take a pause there mid presentation for questions.
Same here.
Sounds good.
Okay, so UBI is a useless bit of information. I like useless bits of information. So World Para-Athletics, originally known as IPC, was started in 1948, and it was a rehabilitation program for soldiers who were returning from World War II. The part that I really like about this UBI was in 2017, the World Champions that was held, the attendance at those championships was more than every other championship combined. And that was held in London, England. So I just thought that's kind of cool that when it went back to England, it just exploded. Since then, you know, the world has not been good. So we don't know what the attendance is going to be like at the next one. So we're going to talk about throws today. And throws is the discipline that has the biggest impact with World Para. So this is going to be a lot of information for you guys to digest. So we're going to start with visually impaired. And my comment was, obviously I thought visually impaired people were going to be looking at this when I created that slide.
We're going to talk about 3 different classes of athletes that are visually impaired. In general, the impairment scales run from a lower number to a higher number, and the lower numbers are typically, not always, but typically more functionally impaired than those with a higher number. So the F11, F stands for field, 11 is the lower number. These individuals are totally blind. These individuals must have an assistant for throws. And the purpose of that assistant is multifunctional to some degree. But the big thing that they do, as you can see in this picture, you've got a guide with a vest, that green vest on, and he's orienting the athlete in the circle. You know, he and the guide can enter the circle whichever way they want, and then he orients them out towards the middle of the sector. So he has some perceptive capability of feeling where he needs to release an implement when he throws. That athlete may, if they perform together that way, go out into the middle of the sector under the supervision of the chief judge and vocally call the athlete from the sector so he has an auditory clue as to where to try and throw the implement. When you see these guys work together, it's really phenomenal to watch them work together as a team. The F11 athletes must wear eye patches. little stick-on eye patches that look like a bandage over their eyes. And on top of that, they must wear a mask that is totally black. And the purpose of the mask is to try and blank out any possibility of light entering their eyes, just in case they may have some flicker of light perception. And the same would be for, as in this case of this picture, the athlete has some glasses on. You can't see it. Typically what they and we will do is we'll put duct tape on the inside of the glasses to ensure they don't see any light coming through the glasses. If the athletes wish, in between throws, they can take the glasses off, but not the patches. Otherwise, they need to have both on during the competition. Any official at any time from the call room all the way out to the field of play may, if they suspect something is not correct, ask the athlete to surrender their glasses and inspect them to make sure that they have them on correctly and make sure that the bandages are on. Next slide. As I said, there are three classes. Here are the first two. The F11s are totally blind, and the F12s are legally blind, but they have some perception, maybe a little bit of peripheral vision. Some of them have pretty severe tunnel vision, so you can imagine the impact that that would have on being able to perform on the field of play. The F11s must have an assistant. The F12s, however, may, if they wish, compete without an assistant. That is their option. And if they choose to have an assistant, basically they'll be performing and competing just like an F11 would. Eye coverings are not required for the F12s, whether they have an assistant or not. And it's possible that the F12, depending on the event, we're talking about throws and not long jump, but we're also talking about javelin. If they may need to have some assistance setting their marks because their vision is severely impacted, but not so much that they're totally blind. Next one. And finally, the F13s, they basically have pretty fair vision impairment, but that partial vision is still a legally visually impaired assessment medically. And they may require also assistance with their marks, but essentially we treat the F13s pretty much like normal, typical ambulatory athletes. There's not much that we typically have to do other than those two, other than maybe helping them set their marks. And the next slide, please. Louise?
So we're going to kind of do a repeat of what the orientation that the assistant does. So the assistant brings the athlete out onto the throwing circle or the runway. He orientates them before the attempt, but he has to leave the circle or the runway before the attempt begins. Again, acoustic orientation is permitted before, during, and after each attempt. And the athletes can also be escorted out of the throw or the runway after the throw is completed. And the other thing is, as officials, if you figure that assistant is in danger where he is, you can move them to another location, keeping in mind that they are well aware of how it works. So usually they're not putting themselves in danger when they're out there, but it is kind of disconcerting to have a blind guy throwing a javelin at you.
Hey, Louise, one thing I often forget is that if the assistant or guide, if you will, goes back to the circle after everything is said and done and tries to guide the athlete back out the back of the circle, he cannot reach in and grab that athlete and assist him out physically, but he can vocally call him out the back.
Right. Yeah. So the timing. So the time clocks begin the moment that as an official, you're satisfied that the athlete has completed their orientation process. If the assistant isn't going out onto the field of play, is once he leaves the circle, then you start the time. And the athletes can also they may ask, you know, as time started so that they know. So if they lose orientation, which doesn't happen quite so much on throws, I guess it could on javelin more so, you stop the clock, and so then the assistant can reorientate them. But you do not reset the clock. You just stop it and restart it once they are orientated again. So the next classification is the 40s and the 41s, which are the short stature, and there is no variation to World Athletics. They follow the same rules.
We have a number of other classes, and these are delineated here. And briefly, we just wanted to kind of indicate to you what they are. When you officiate these events, it's really very helpful to understand what not only what the disability is, but what the functional impairment is for each of these classifications. So you have a feel for why the rules are working the way they do. The F20s are intellectually impaired. Their assessment for being legal in competition is an assessment of IQ and a few other things that take place by neuropsychologists that are trained in that area. The F35s through 38s, cerebral palsy typically, but brain injury can result in similar deficits that the CP athletes have, and that's typically from an injury that takes place at birth. The F42s through 44s, it's a lower limb deficiency. The athletes still have their limbs, but functionally, they don't work at all or very poorly. But they have not had to amputate those lower limbs. The F45s through 47s are upper limb deficiencies. So from the shoulder on down, with or without amputation. So there's no difference whether you're amputated or not with the upper limbs. And the F61s through 64s is another lower limb deficiency, but these athletes have had their limbs amputated. So for example, the 61s or 62s are bilateral above the knee or below the knee. And the 63s and 64s are unilateral above the knee or below the knee. So you can imagine the varying functional limitation due to their injury is pretty significant, but they're great fun to watch compete. One thing that most of these athletes do, and we allow assistants to do it either by an official or an assistant that's out on the field to play if that qualifies, is we can set their markers in an individual event. Next slide.
Just to clarify, for them to have an assistant on field to play has to be approved by a technical delegate. And
good point.
Jerry and I talked about this. We've never seen it approved. At best, they have a sheet that they've completed ahead of time. And so then as officials, you can look at the sheet and know where they want their marks placed. I mean, in the odd circumstances, an assistant can be granted to be out there, but highly unlikely.
Sometimes you get athletes with multiple disabilities, and that would be a more likely case.
Yeah.
And of course, we're talking about ambulatory athletes here.
Yeah. So, and speaking of ambulatory athletes, so we have, if the athlete has a prosthetic device, they have the option of using it or not using it for field events. But the biggest thing you have to remember that if they choose to compete with that prosthetic, they have to do all of their attempts with the prosthetic. If they choose not to use the prosthetic, then they can't use it for any attempts. So whatever the decision they make at the beginning of the competition is the decision they have to stick with throughout the whole competition, or that event rather. Now we get to the fun stuff. It's the athletes who compete seated. So we have the cerebral palsy and the brain athletes with a brain injury. And so again, you can see it's the lower numbers. It's the 31s to 34s. And then the ones with the limb deficiencies, 51s to 57s. And some of these they got some big upper muscles. So when these guys get out there, you really got to be watching because they're big boys. So
speaking of big boys.
Yes. So judging seated throws is not a simple task. So the first three things that you need to be watching for or be aware of is the throwing frame certification that has to meet certain specifications. You have to be aware of how that frame is positioned within the circle. And then also the process of the athlete transferring or accessing that frame. So we're going to talk about those three events first. I had a thought. Oh, as far as the frame certification goes, the process for that is usually, since the new rules came out with throwing frames, there's usually a courtesy check. You know, the first day that the majority of the frames are there, the technical delegates will do a courtesy check to make sure they're legal. And that way, if they're not, they have time to correct it. But the actual certification of it happens in the call room. But once it lands out on field of play, as officials on the field of play, you have the right to re-inspect that. And especially you need to re-inspect it is if that chair came out and then the athlete puts a cushion on top of it, you need to be remeasuring it.
Well, we're talking about inspecting throwing frames in advance. There are certain specification requirements for each of these devices, and they're very standardized. The maximum height of the throwing frame to the very top of the cushion without an athlete sitting on the frame is 75 centimeters. And we're actually quite strict about that. We don't want an athlete sitting on a foamy cushion and that cushion shrinking down and not realizing it's going to give them a little bit of extra boost in the end. The seat must be square or rectangular, and each side must be at a minimum of 30 centimeters. So we're all out there with measuring tapes or sticks with marks on it, trying to measure all these things. How tall is it? How high is it? The chair must be level, or it must be in a reclining position. In other words, the front of the chair can be higher than the back, but the back of the chair cannot be higher than the front. The rationale therefore for that is that if it tilts forward, that might facilitate the athlete following through during the throw, because it's kind of like they're going downhill. They're not having to compete with gravity as much. Next slide.
And obviously we're repeating ourselves quite a bit here tonight.
Yeah.
So to reiterate, yes, they must be level. And I took this photo in Tokyo because one of the biggest things that we saw was the chair was, it wasn't level and it inclined towards the front. So we came up with, or I shouldn't say we, one of the officials from Japan came up with this brilliant idea of taping water bottle caps to the front two legs and just brought it up enough so that it was then level or slightly inclined to the back. It was a brilliant solution. I don't know if it stood up. I don't know if it stood up under the weight of the athletes, but it made the chair legal.
Okay, all parts of the throwing frame must be fixed. In other words, the frame must not flex. The rationale behind that is if the chair flexes, say during the preparatory phase of a throw, there's a possibility that that frame may store energy so that when the athlete follows through with the throw, that flexion and storing of energy may help facilitate the athlete's movement forward, especially for more severely impaired athletes, not so much for those that are in the higher categories. Each chair can have a front, a back, or a side rest for safety and stability. The backrest, as you can see in this particular picture, is actually a bunch of tape wrapped around a piece of foam, which is wrapped in cloth. The thickness of that foam for a backrest may not exceed 5 centimeters in thicknesses. So when we do chair checks, we walk around with a measuring tape and we measure how thick that backrest or side rest really is and make a judgment on that. If it's too big, we often say, go grab some duct tape and wrap it really tight, and that will probably squish it enough to make it legal. Foot plates, if they are used, not everybody uses a foot plate, but they are to be used only for support and stability. They can't be on the ground. Next slide. Okay, you can see in a lot of these frames, there's a number of there, and you'll probably see several more coming up, is that there's a vertical pole. Used to be called a holding bar, but it's now just called a vertical bar. That is to assist the athlete for stability. What we have to be careful about is that that holding bar may flex a little bit and store energy just like a frame might. So that's another part of this discussion we'll get into in a moment. But the holding bar must be attached to the frame itself. It can't have any articulating joints in it. And the one nuance that we add to this is a number of these athletes, especially more severely impaired, their grip is impaired, especially on a hot summer day when you're sweating like a pig out there and grabbing onto that metal pole. You can imagine how slippery that might get. So we do allow some use, judicious use of tape to wrap around there to give the athletes a little bit better grip. And indeed, we consider this more of a safety thing than anything else. Next slide. The vertical bar in old days used to flex a lot, and we had a problem with that. And we began to allow an additional frame piece to be added to the construction of the chair. As you can see, that angular piece attached to the frame and attached to the vertical pole to keep it from bending. In other words, that pole can't bend and it can't store energy and it can't help the athlete make their throw. Next slide. Okay, I think this one is not a movie, right?
No, it's just a picture.
Right, okay. Athletes are gonna move around in their chairs a lot. And what we're talking about here, and you can really see it down here, this is a typical pre-inspection down here. There are a lot of seated throwing chairs, and off to the right, you can see a lot of racing chairs that we won't talk about today since we're discussing throws. But we'll come in here and do basically a mass execution and come in here and find all the chairs that don't meet specification. And then we write up what's wrong with it so that the coaches and the athletes can come in and find out what's wrong and hopefully be able to fix it and correct it by the time the competition starts. Because remember, all of this equipment goes through the call room no matter what happens before. The guy up there, he's got his hand on that vertical bar. He's reared back in his preparatory phase of the throw. He's in pretty good shape there. And that's basically a typical throwing position for these guys. Next slide, please.
Yeah, just want to point out though that there can be slight movement of the bar. Stress the word slight because it's physically impossibility to eliminate all flex. The other thing that, I mean, not that we're going to be coaching during the event, but you can see that bar is obviously a lot taller than what it is. And so that's one of the tactics that these athletes got to use is they got to bring their arm down more so that the bar doesn't flex as much. So throwing circles, going to touch on this very briefly. As officials, we don't have to, well, usually set up the throwing circles. We can use movable platforms, can be used if the technical delegate approves it. And so these, they don't have to be a full circle. They just have to have a piece at the front that has the circumference like a circle would. And yeah, we either throw out of the discus or the shot put. So the biggest thing that we usually use is tie down rails. In this incident, they're pegged outside of the circle. More often than not, what I've seen in Canada is there's actually holes drilled into the cement, and those rails are attached, right to the cement. The other one is the picture of the portable frame platform, and you can see there the circle that has to be there so that it helps judge where the chair is located. So these are some examples of the portable platforms. And I got a little cursor. So you can see there that it's got the curve, so to help judge. This one is an interesting one. Athletes can compete in their day chair, long as it meets the qualifications. So once they come up, so what they do is they just ride their day chair up onto this platform. Then once they're up there, long as they're not greater than 75 centimeters, then they compete from that. You don't see it very often, but you just need to be aware. And obviously in cases like that, the athlete comes with his own platform to do that. This is supplied by the competition, either the rails or the platforms, but this the athlete brings because they're not using a regular frame.
One thing too about these mobile platforms is that we always, based on the arc of the circle that's in front, to the center point, so we have a point through which to draw the tape if we're using steel tapes or fiberglass tapes.
Good point. I think that is oh, look at that. So the first thing you have to do when you're officiating is make sure that you have the right implements for the classes that you're throwing. So you can see an example here of, so these ones, if you've got F33s and 34s competing together, which quite often they do, some of them are going to be using a 3K and some of them are going to be using 4K. So you need to make sure that they're out there. You need to make sure that they're identified separately so somebody doesn't accidentally grab the wrong one. And you need to be very aware of which athlete can use which thing, which implement. So always check your flight sheet and the stamp on the equipment to make sure that the athlete is receiving the right equipment. And then you're also noting it on your sheet, which implement that they're using. So F31s to 33s and F51s to 54s are permitted an assistant that helps them transfer from their day chair to their throwing frame. It's done under the supervision of an official. And the assistant also helps them strap into the throwing frame. So you can see here that this official is telling what he is telling that assistant is not to be coaching while he's out there, because odds are that assistant really truly is a coach. So which is also part of the reason is those assistants have to be seated separately than the athletes because they're going to be coaching. So you need to have them seated separately. So the classes 34 to 50 and 55 to 57, they have to transfer to that frame themselves and they have to strap without assistance. They've figured out all the tricks on how to do that. But the biggest thing you have to remember that as officials and volunteers are not allowed to assist those athletes in any way, being it, helping them pick up their straps, or more importantly, helping them transfer from their day chair to the frame.
I think the only exception to that would be in case of immediate impending injury.
Correct.
Somebody's about to fall, you're not going to let them fall, that kind of thing. And one other thing I think it's important just to remind everybody, these athletes that are allowed to operate under these conditions with an assistant are more functionally impaired. Hence, you look at the F31 through 33, those are the lower numbers. Those class numbers for the cerebral palsy group go up to be higher numbers. They don't automatically get an assistant, nor does the F51 through 54s, which are kind of the typical spinal cord injury or spina bifida type of athlete.
So the strapping that is used, I guess we're going to have a whole other session talking about strapping down, but there's the strapping of the chair to the ground, and then there's the strapping of the athlete to the chair. So the strapping that's used by the athlete has to be non-elastic. In other words, it can't be helping them, and an elastic is going to have too much give, and it's going to allow for movement. If you have somebody who does compete in their day chair, you have to give them adequate time to be strapping that chair down, which we'll kind of talk about a little bit more in just a second. So all parts of the frame, the foot press, everything have to be within the vertical plane of the rim of the circle. So the frame is set in there first, it's tied down. Sometimes they have somebody sit on that chair to hold it in place while they strap it down. You can even get a plumb bob out if you want to make sure that that chair is totally behind the circle. But body parts, very important to remember, body parts can project outside the vertical plane. And this is prime examples. Her toes are over, her knees are over. This gentleman here, his foot is definitely over. So totally fine that the body parts project past the vertical plane. Common error. Oh, look at that. So another concession, again, for the athletes that have more impairment, the 51s to 53s, they can put a glove on their non-throwing hand. These athletes can also, again, because they have problems gripping, they can also tape their hand to that bar. Again, all part of their allotted time for getting in there. And if they want to tape their hand to the bar, it doesn't have to have a glove on it. They can just tape their hand to it. That's their choice. So how much time is allocated for these athletes to secure themselves? So the 32s to 34s and the 54s to 57, they're allowed 4 minutes to transfer from their chair to their frame. And that being said, some of them, believe it or not, are still ambulatory. They can walk up to that chair, not well, but they can walk up to that frame and get in it. So they have 4 minutes to get into their frame, strap themselves down, and take all their practice throws. They can take as many practice throws as they want within that 4 minutes. If they want to quit earlier, they can, but that's the most they get is 4 minutes. The athletes that aren't as functional is the 31s and the 51s to 53s. They're given an extra minute to get more time to get, I mean, even with assistant in there helping it, they just need more time to get everything strapped down. So I said they don't need to take all that time, but there is going to be incidences where the athlete still isn't ready and their 4 minutes has expired. So what happens then is chief judge instructs the official or volunteer who's on the clock to start the minute timer. So you start the minute timer, and that continues while the athlete is getting themselves strapped in. If they by chance get strapped in within that minute, they can still throw. And each time that minute expires, you should give a few seconds thinking, okay, the implement's walking back, start the time again, and they lose another throw. And if I've never seen it happen, I've seen them lose throws, but I've never seen them to lose all of it. But it is entirely possible that they could lose all the time for all 6 throws. So something you need to be aware of. We don't like to see it happen, but it can happen. So everybody's always allowed 6 throws. It can be set up in pools, doesn't usually happen. So usually it's they get 6 throws, they come in, they get strapped down, they do their 6 throws, and we measure after every throw. So just like any other athlete, they are allowed 1 minute for throw, and the timing of that starts, obviously, we don't start the timer when we call them up. When the implement is presented to the athlete, right? And quite often you'll go up there and you'll take the rack up there, or you're going to take 2 or 3 shot puts up there. Once those implements are presented to the athlete for them to choose which one they want to use, that's when you start the timer. So they get 1 minute to throw, then you measure it, they do another one. So in between the 3rd and the 4th throw, they are given 1 extra minute to take a rest. If they have an assistant with them, the assistant can bring them water. And in that time, obviously they're a coach and they can coach them briefly. I mean, if the coach is on the sidelines, they can be talking to them just like any other able-bodied athlete. Especially if it's a hot day and they don't have an assistant out there, we will go get their water bottle for them, right? We're not that cruel. And the other thing is you got to remember is they don't have to take that full minute. And quite often they don't want to take that full minute. They're allowed it, but if they don't want to take it, they'll take 30 seconds or take a sip of water and then they move on.
Judging secured throws. I will tell you now that doing seated throws next to calling flats on a javelin is the most difficult judging thing that you will ever do in parasport or any other sport in terms of athletics. It involves the throwing actions. The rules vary sometimes a little bit between each of them. We all have stereotypical ideas of what a good shot put throw should look like. We'll talk about that here in a minute. The vertical bar, you can see this gentleman has his hand on that vertical bar. Again, that vertical bar can't bend and store energy. So we look at that bar while we're judging things to see if it bends, storing energy, and we would call that a foul. Lifting. It's a difficult concept to understand, but basically the athlete must remain in a seated position until the implement lands. Used to be some of these athletes were fairly well impaired and had to be remain seated because they couldn't do anything else. But we had some polio athletes who actually had one good limb, and they would plant that limb on the ground and push themselves, facilitating that forward motion and release. So it really wasn't fair to the overall population. So the rules were changed. We don't allow anyone to do anything else but remain seated. And we'll talk about what that rule really implies. And of course, you're judging the throw in the sector, the landing points, the usual kind of things that you would normally do as an official.
The athletes really didn't like it when that new rules came out that everybody had to be seated. Everybody had to seat. They couldn't do that. And the really cool part about it is those bars that they used to use pole vault poles, and they had some real flex.
Oh, yeah.
It was fun to watch seated throws. Not that it still isn't fun.
Okay, I mentioned a moment ago that we changed some rules. F32 athletes, fairly functionally impaired. Most of them, but not all of them, had cerebral palsy. And cerebral palsy winds up creating a number of movement issues for these athletes. They have contractures that limit their movements. They have difficulty coordinating their movements. And sometimes they have uncontrolled movements. So you can imagine with the rules of shot put, how difficult it might be for some of these athletes to be able to throw that implement within the standard rules. So what we have done, is that on the next slide, Louise? I don't remember. We don't. No, it's just this slide, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. What we have done is for these athletes, we allow the shot put in the hand to come away from the chin during the throw. Another piece of this, you can't see it in this picture, is the part of the rule that reads that it must be put in a straight and continuous motion. The majority of these athletes cannot do that. They are not physically capable of doing that. When they go to extend their hand, the hand direction goes in many different ways. As you can see it, she almost looks like she's about to do a baseball pitch right there. And that's what makes it difficult to do the shot put for the F32s. Or do they bring it behind the shoulder? Bringing it behind the shoulder for these guys is still a foul. So we changed a couple of the rules. It's because of the disaster that we had in Rio in 2016. We only had 6 athletes from around the world come together and compete in the finals. So we decided that we needed to change something to be able to allow these functionally limited athletes to compete. It's one of the tenets of IPC and World Para-Athletics to try and facilitate these processes. Next slide, please.
Just so you know, this picture is an anomaly. So,
okay, all right.
I've made myself a note to change it out. Sarah Mickey is not an F32 athlete. So if you see her in Langley, she better not be doing this. It will be a foul if she does it.
Okay, just paint a red flag in up there then.
Yeah.
For sure.
So interesting things that can happen. I guess this is kind of out of place. It should have been back a little bit further. So in the remote possibility that if the chains or straps break that hold the chair to the platform, then if it happens during the throw, then the athlete has the option of they can take another throw or they can take the result. So obviously, if they don't like the throw, they're going to say, yes, I would like to take another one, or keep it as it is. So no foul occurs if they did foul, because attaching that throwing frame to the platform or the rails or whatever the case may be, that's our responsibility. It's the responsibility of the officials and the volunteers. So if we screwed up on securing it, we can't penalize the athlete because we maybe didn't do the job right or had faulty equipment. However, if the straps that secure the athlete to their throwing frame break, then the results will be judged and measured just as like you would normally do, regardless of what happened. If in the process they lifted, well, then it's going to be called a lifting foul. If they fouled it out of sector, it's going to be a foul, because the process of securing themselves to that chair is their responsibility. So, and athletes are responsible for their own equipment. So we don't hold up an event. We don't give them concessions for faulty equipment. My biggest thing that I tell new officials, if you want to offend a Paralympic athlete, treat them differently. You treat them just like anybody else. These are the rules, and this is what applies to you. Don't feel sorry for them because they're sitting in a chair. These are the rules. Your equipment broke. It's a foul. But you, as we all know, able-bodied athletes, if they don't want that throw measured, they just tap out or exit illegally, and the throw's not measured. So obviously, if you're in a chair, that's not an option. So we do have it that if the athlete touches the strap outside the vertical plane of the rim of the throwing circle, we call it a foul. So that's their option of saying, no, I don't want that unmeasured. So any questions up to this point?
There are two in the Q&A section, Louise.
Okay.
The first
Jerry,
is about markers.
Okay.
What does a marker look like? Are the markers placed / removed before and after each attempt, or do they stay there for the entire competition?
The markers are the same thing that would apply to any able-bodied athlete. So on javelin, it's going to be, usually it's whatever you provide to them, you know, a piece of tape or whatever the case may be, right? That rule doesn't change. It's just the concession is their ability to put it out there. Does that make sense?
Okay. And the other question was about sectors. What size sector is used for throws? Is it the same as?
Oh, I stopped sharing. It is because we're either using the discus or the shot. So it is, I'm sorry, I don't remember numbers. Let me go back.
20 by 12. Yeah, you still have a narrower javelin runway, or you have a typical sector for, say, a discus runway. Sorry, or a discus circle.
Yeah.
So you've got 20 out, 20 meters out and 10 across and 20 back. That would be a typical discus sector. Gives you the angle that you need. And then for javelin, it's 20 out and 10 across.
So javelin is thrown from a shot put circle. For ambulatory athletes, yeah. It's all the same, right? Ambulatory athletes, it's the same as able-bodied. For seated throws, javelin is thrown from the shot put circle with the rails. For discus and club, it is thrown from the discus cage. And sorry, obviously shot put is also thrown from the shot put circle. So club and discus are always thrown from the cage, especially club.
Yeah, javelin is even thrown from that same wider sector.
Yeah.
From a chair.
Okay, Jerry, you need to take control.
No, do I? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can do this. Not working too well, Louise. Let me try this, hang on. Sorry, folks. Technology is great until it doesn't work. Almost there. Let's see if this works. Okay, are you there, Louise?
Jerry, so you should be able to share.
Okay.
I don't see your screen.
Hang on, I think we got it. Are you able to see a screen now?
There you go. Yeah, perfect. You just
okay, a guy in a red jersey on a platform?
Yeah, you just need to put it in play.
How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, all right. So we've mentioned the vertical bar a few times, and what we thought we'd do is provide you a few videos to kind of bring to you visually what we're talking about. You know, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I truly believe in that. So this particular athlete is going to throw the shot put. I'm not going to translate what he really said. Whoops. Okay, watch the vertical bar.
Question is it flexing?
Yeah. It kind of looks like it's flexing, but when you looked carefully at the platform, the platform and the chair were all moving together to give a visual impression that the vertical bar was actually bending and storing energy, and that was not the case. When you have big athletes like this gentleman right here on a platform, if the platform isn't designed very well, and you can see we have weightlifting weights on here and it still wasn't enough, he's still moving that platform. That's not uncommon. So when you set up these events and you have a feel for who the athletes are, identifying locations where you can obtain more weight to hold the platform down is really critical to be able to set up a good competition for these gentlemen.
Yeah, and if the platform is on grass, make sure they really know how to secure it. I've seen them, they put the holding things in backwards, and yeah, the whole thing then starts lifting off the ground.
Yeah, very true. Especially in events that aren't like major events, but they're more local events, you're typically going to wind up putting platforms in the grass or something, which is perfectly legitimate. But soft grass gets kind of mushy, and those spikes that you might use to hold the platform on the ground start loosening up, and it can be a bit of a headache. Okay, I think it was in Dubai, if I'm not remembering correctly. This is a Russian gentleman who's throwing shot put. I'm going to let you watch the video here. Okay, it's trying to load it. Sorry, guys. Okay. Okay. Watch the vertical bar. Right there where my pointer is. Okay. Okay. Look at that aluminum edge on that box behind him, and look how far that box comes. That aluminum edge is vertical. And at that point, that bar is no longer vertical. At that point, you're going to raise a red flag and DQ that athlete. It's up to the athlete's responsibility to be able to design a chair and secure that vertical bar. And remember, he could have had that angular piece that would hold that bar in place so that he can throw it legally. And this gentleman at the time did not do that. And right there, hang on. Okay, bends the bar, and look at that. Not only does the bar bend, but his hand comes way away from his chin. So you've got two red flags there. Happens relatively frequently. You know, some individuals, they're not coached well enough, or either they or the coaches don't understand the rules well enough to be able to completely comply with them. And it's unfortunate that we have to, you know, disqualify them. But it's a learning experience, and they come back and they do better, and it's part of the game.
What I'd like to point out is if you let that video run, look at you got one volunteer, you got two officials standing out there on field of play.
There's one of them right there.
Right, but in my opinion, you need more people at the circle judging the shot, judging the bar, judging lifting. You can't have too many officials back there.
Yeah. But we're not even talking about lifting yet, but you're right. We need a team here doing in a competition probably needs 5 people to be able to adequately do the job at a major competition. Less so at a local competitions for sure. And we're going to talk more about what the details are of lifting here in just a few moments. And see if I can, okay, well, come on. Sorry about that, folks. Okay. Again, as I said before, the hardest part of seated throws is judging the lifting. You have three elements that you need to observe and rule on all at the same time. And you can imagine how difficult that is for one person to do, hence the need for additional individuals to do that. You need to first identify, well, where should I be standing in order to have an optimum view of what's going on with that athlete in terms of the throw, in terms of whether they're lifting, all the elements of lifting. We're going to talk about it in a second. Lifting involves remaining seated. So if the buttocks come off the chair, they're no longer seated. So we have to keep an eye out for that. And also, and I'll discuss this in a second, if the knees come away from the seat of the chair, we believe that it construes an advantage as well. And we kind of combine that into the lifting rule.
The other thing is to be cognizant of is the rules also state that these athletes need to be wearing tight-fitting clothing. Again, once we talk more about lifting, you're going to understand why. So if they're wearing really loose clothes, it's going to be extremely difficult to judge. Most of them are not going to do that because they're aware that if we can't see it right, they got a chance of getting fouled out. But you have the right to say to them, you know what, we need to put some duct tape around there just to hold it a little tighter, or whatever the case may be.
For sure. This is a drawing from the rule book, from the World Para-Athletics rule book, just so that we can have a discussion about what lifting is. This is the seat, the cushion on the seat. And the rule states that you must remain seated at all times once you begin the process of throwing until the implement lands. And you must remaining seated. The definition of that is your buttocks and lower limbs must remain on the cushion from this point at the bottom of the pelvis called the ischial tuberosity all the way forward, as you can follow my pointer here, to the back of the knee. That is the definition that we have chosen to use. So not only if this part of the buttocks lifts up into the air, then you are no longer seated. If the back of the knee comes away from the front of the seat, by definition, you are no longer seated. So again, the problem is you have to be looking at the knees and you have to be looking at the buttock all at the same time. So indeed, good officiating involves more than one or two people at the pit.
The other point that is also difficult, you stole my slide.
Sorry.
It's quite all right. So yes, the bottom of that bone has to remain in contact, but in some of those athletes, there is a lot of flesh behind that bone. It's fine for that flesh to lift up. Long as that bone does not leave the top of the chair, that flesh can move.
Great point. And we actually have a video that we'll show you here in just a second. So again, a lifting is a deviation from a true seated position. A lot of effort went into trying to define what truly being seated is, and we're stuck with that. The critical points again are this is proper seating. The ischial tuberosity, the bottom of the pelvis, that pointy part, is in intimate contact with the seat as well as the back of the knee and all points in between. Okay, that's important. From here to here has to be in contact with the seat. Here over here would be considered lifting. If you look in the front of the cushion here, there's a gap behind the knee between the cushion and the leg. And as an official, were that to occur during the process of throwing an implement, then you would call that, it would be a red flag. Now, as you can imagine, this is not the easiest thing to do in the world. And a hint I might offer to you based on experience is where in the heck is this ischial tuberosity? You've got an athlete sitting there, maybe with baggy pants, maybe not. and you can't see their pelvis. You can't see whether they're slouched and their pelvis is tilted a little bit, those kinds of things. But what, if you have time, what you can ask them to do if they're capable is to ask them to lay forward all the way on top of their knees. So the chest comes down here, lays down on top of the knees, and that's going to stretch this flexi buttock really tight across the tailbone here, the sacrum, and all the way down here and tightly across this point. So roughly where this line, which is now stretched along here, where that touches the cushion is going to be an approximation of where that ischial tuberosity is. So you can kind of remember that visually and watch for that during the throw and see if that point, at that point, you see daylight under there, then that's lifting and you would call that a foul. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, again,
So,
true seated position.
My turn.
Yeah,
So-
oh, I'm sorry, this is yours.
so
We
the athlete
should have talked
has
about
to,
this, huh?
so the athlete has to say truly seated to be judged fair. So if they are not in compliance with those rules, that's what we call lifting. So the intention of all these new rules is, well, it's not new, but whatever, is to minimize the contribution that those legs are going to make to the athlete's performance. Again, trying to make it a little bit more level playing field. So yes, the athletes have to remain seated with both legs in contact with the seat from the back of the knee to the back of the buttocks. So yeah, you got to be watching them both. So, and this picture demonstrates that some athletes straddle the chair, but you can see in both instances that that chair is right up to the back of their knee. Totally legit. Also got to remember, if these athletes are also an amputee, there is no back of the knee. So obviously what leg they have has to be in contact with the chair.
Good point. Okay, we are going to try and show you what a lifting foul looks like. Here first, I'm going to run this video and watch this gentleman. You can watch the vertical pole, you can watch his knees, and you can watch the buttocks back here. I would guess roughly ischial tuberosity is probably about right in there. I'm gonna run the video. Okay, one more time. So, gets the implement, brings it up, doing what's normal. He goes into the preparatory phase of the throw. The pole doesn't bend too much. It bends a little bit, but that's acceptable. He goes throw it forward and look where his buttocks are. That would be a red flag. Now, watch his knees right here. Same thing. You can see his knee comes way away from the front of the chair. So he violates the lifting rule in two ways. His knees come away from the front of the chair and his buttocks come way up above. And as you can see here, that's roughly where the ischial tuberosity is. Now, this is an example where we don't have a lifting foul, if I can get the video to play. Okay, here's his buttocks right here. He's probably about right here. Okay, he kind of hops up a little bit. Just run that one more time. Okay, so basically, preparatory phase of the throw, he comes back. What's that? Watch that left knee. You see that left knee move out? Happens every time. Your body cannot stop from doing that. That's why we use straps. But we're just talking about the lifting foul in terms of the buttocks here. So this is, in total, this is not a great example, but we're looking at his buttocks. You can see the fleshy part of the buttock comes up off the ground because back here, his pelvis is tilted back at an angle and the ischium has moved forward. And that's just fleshy buttock back there. So basically before the throw and then after the throw. And that's about where the ischium is. So he has not violated the lifting rule there. But during the preparatory phase of the throw, if you're a right hand individual, you bring that right hand back because your pelvis is tied to your spine. Your left leg goes forward unless you have a strap that stops it from moving there. That's why watching the front of the legs is really important. The preparatory phase of the throw, the left leg will go forward. During the throw, the left leg will come back against the chair and the right leg will go forward. It's a stereotypical pattern that you have to be aware of and kind of watch when you're looking at these rules. Do you have any comments, Louise?
You know what? This is a judgment call on the part of the official, right? So
they all are, yeah.
Yes, it's subjective. So it always goes down to, if you're in doubt, you know what? The doubt, you rule on behalf of the athlete.
Oh yeah, for sure. And you'll have a video referee that can challenge everything you say, right? Every rule you make.
Yes. I don't.
Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Rest assured, we're not going to have that at nationals, I don't think. So it's all on you as officials.
Oh, good. Okay, question here. Gonna run a video. Think about it. I wanted you to think about what your judgment would be if you were the official standing in the position of the camera. Okay, we'll run it really quickly again. You watch the pole, you watch the buttocks. Don't have a great view of the knees right here. Hopefully somebody else is watching the knees there. Okay. So in your mind, is that a lift or not? It is a lift. And as you can see, there's an awful lot of air here. And you can see her position, she twists to the right and comes forward, and that left cheek comes up. So both buttocks do not have to become elevated above the chair in order to be able to call a lifting foul. And that's kind of why I have this video in here. And
so
go ahead.
I like the note. It says that official is in a good position to observe this. So true. He's in the exact right spot, but he's not watching.
Oh yeah, yeah. But the note says he's in good position, not that he's watching.
Yeah.
Absolutely, you're absolutely correct. So what you do. My best advice to you, if you're going to be doing field events and doing throws, seated throws, is to watch what they do during the warm-up. If you watch them during the warm-up, you'll see what kind of movements they do. You'll see if they're kind of coming close to lifting in the buttocks. Maybe it's the knees are a problem, or maybe nothing's really a problem. You don't have to worry about it. But that will give you a clue about where you need to orient yourself in order to be watched as much as you can in order to make good calls for these athletes. Whoops, sorry about that. Okay, here's another one. Does this athlete lift? Okay. Now he's sitting here. He comes all the way back. You notice how much that chair flexes? Watch that vertical pole flex. But we're talking about the buttocks here. A number of things go wrong with this throw. But did he lift? That's the highest point. And if you look over here, that's that point right here. What happens is when he's sitting here, his pelvis is sitting back here at an angle like that. So his ischium is way up here. And all he does when he goes forward to throw is he sits up straight. And those ischium are still on the cushion. So again, it's a tough one to call. But you can see the chair was flexing. It wasn't tied down very well. He's a big guy and he's on a cheap aluminum frame. That's part of the problem. A number of factors get taken into play when you're following these.
But they definitely have enough officials there to observe what's going on.
No, You know, these are the volunteers back here. There's an official. He's looking over here somewhere. She's watching the buttocks and didn't raise a flag. So that's good because that wasn't the issue. Okay, we talked about knees a little bit. Let's focus on the knees. Let's just watch this real quickly. Watch here. Okay. Watch this profile here. Okay. Okay, he rears back, that left knee goes forward. He starts to throw, the left knee comes backwards and the right knee goes forward. He's a right-handed thrower. So either way, and the problem is he has these straps right here. They're on the top of his knee. His strapping should be adjusted such that they prevent the knee from going forward. So he's not doing a great job. Poor coaching, or neither he or the coach was kind of entirely aware of this component of the rule too. That happens unfortunately frequently.
I think he needs a new frame.
That left knee is way forward. This one's back here. That's the preparatory phase of the throw. So I hope that makes sense. Next slide here. Yeah, there you go. So this just describes what I was talking about. I think it's a good example. It's in some ways it's a little subtle, but it's obvious when you take a close look at it. And this happens, like I said, a lot of time, and it's bad strapping. And I would remind you that it is not your job to tell them how to strap. They come to this competition, they should be ready, they should be prepared, and they should understand the rules and be able to put themselves in a position that will allow them to comply when they throw to stay within the rules.
There's also, during the phase when they're practicing, that's the time to really watch. And at that point, you can confer with fellow officials and say, hey, what do you think about that guy? Do you think that's going to work?
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can't see it here, but I kind of remember this guy because I took the video. His buttocks were fine. So I wandered around to the side to look at his knees. And that's when you can see this. But I watched him while he was throwing and when he was warming up. He took 3 or 4 throws and I watched him. His buttocks were not moving a whole lot. I don't remember his class, but his knees were moving all over the place, and that's part of the rule.
So club is one of the very interesting components about para. Again, because of the functionality of these athletes, they can't hang on to regular implements. So we've started this club throw. So kind of like a bowling pin. So you can see it's got the knob on the top for them to help hang on to it. So they hang on to the neck and they have the choice of throw it facing forward or facing backwards. You can see this athlete is facing backwards. The same rules apply for them being in contact with the chair. The biggest thing about club throw is, these athletes tend to be wild. I've seen it come out over the top of the discus cage. You got to make sure that your volunteers are back a long ways. You have to make sure that whoever's going into the cage to hand them the club, be prepared to run out of the cage, because that athlete might be starting his throwing motion before you're out of the cage. It's a dangerous one.
Okay, here are a couple of valid throws. One on the left is a gentleman who's straddling the corner, and he's going to be throwing forward. He's a club thrower. Watch him throw. You can see how spastic he is. As soon as he initiates that hard throwing motion, his control of that trunk musculature and his shoulders is a little bit difficult to control. That's why these guys throw the club. And you look here, he's straddling the corner. At the very least, the outside part behind the knee is in touch with the chair. So he's okay there. That's a perfectly legitimate throw. Okay, this is, as you can see, this athlete is throwing backwards. Very common. For many of these athletes, it's the most efficient way for them to throw. And you watch the knees, you watch the buttocks. That slight lift was the fleshy part of the buttock back there, and the knees did not move. She's actually strapped in really very well. Okay, here's another one. Okay, so this athlete, you can see a lot of spasticity is inherent in her. When she activates her muscles, it throws herself into spasm, but she actually was able to execute that throw fairly well. But let's look at something here. She makes a couple of warm-ups. She's trying to control her spasticity. Goes into the preparatory phase again, and then comes back. Oh, one more, and leans back. And what do you see right there? Her buttocks are entirely off the seat. So you can lift even though you're throwing backwards over the back of the chair. That's the point. That's the point here. You can see it here. Let me shut the noise off. You can see right under here, she's at full extension. It's okay if the back of the chair is angled in this direction to facilitate the throw. That doesn't violate the rules, but you can see she comes completely off. Her knees are fine. The back of the knee is right here up against the edge of the front of the seat, but her buttocks are way off the ground. So be aware that when somebody's throwing the club and they're doing it backwards, you can lift. Her strapping was either too loose or wasn't done well enough to hold her down. A lot of spasm in that lady.
So I think what you can figure out by listening to us is if you see that they are well strapped in, odds are good that there's not going to be any fouls. Yeah. But if their strapping seems lacking, yeah, you better make sure everybody's watching, because the odds of them fouling are going to be better.
We really hope that in the future we'll be able to put on some coaching seminars to adequately train the coaches to understand these nuances of complying the rule when you throw, because there are an awful lot of athletes who are at kind of the lower end of functionality, and we provide them with the best way possible for them to compete. But we need to know how to train them to stay within the rules, because the rules are the rules.
Yep. So the last thing that we want to talk about briefly is records. For a world record to stand, 3 judges must sign the form, and 3 judges better be out there looking at the tape before they sign that form. We've seen incidences where world records were set and 3 judges didn't go look, and so the record didn't stand. So heartbreaking. And then as far as the tape and the laser is no different than able-bodied, right? You got to use the steel tape, and if you're using electronic, you got to calibrate it ahead of time with the tape. And yeah, when we were usually now we have to, the rules now state that you got to calibrate it before the competition, during the competition, and after the competition.
One other point here too is that having to sign the form implies that you actually went over and did the measurement. So 3 people have to look at the measurement and confirm that they all 3 read the same measurement, or at least put down the measurement they read next to their signature, because there's a spot on the form for it. Important.
So I see we got one question. It says, how to measure the implement lands if a portion of the throwing frame is preventing the tape to be pulled straight through the center of the circle. You usually, I mean, sometimes it's a bit of a challenge to get the tape through the frame, but it always works to get the tape through there.
At mid-level to local level competitions, we will use irrigation spotting flags with thin little wires, and they have red flags on them, and we'll number them 1 through 6. And every time somebody throws, the landing spot is marked, and we put one of those flags deep into the ground and leave it there. So
we're all going la, 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 because we didn't hear that, because we're getting ready for nationals. So yes, you have to measure every throw at the time, but if it is a pain to thread that tape through the throwing frame, you can leave that part of the tape laying under the chair. It's not going to bother the athlete during the throw. So you just kind of leave it laying there, and then tighten it up when you go to measure.
Yeah. And of course, it's very easy if you're doing laser measurement.
Yes.
You don't have to worry about that. Any other questions? Anthony, you see anything?
No, I don't see any other questions.
Okay.
Go to the last slide. If you do have questions, feel free to email us and ask us anytime.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're here to get everybody excited about officiating in parasport. And we're happy to answer any kind of questions, give you some advice, kind of whatever your needs are, please reach out to us.
And we probably should have put David's email there too, because you can see he's answering questions for us in the chat too.
Oh, okay, cool. I can't see the chat, so I didn't even know he was there. Sorry, David. I think somebody could probably give you David's email address. I think everybody knows David.
Yeah.
Anthony, are we good?
I think we're good. Thank you so much for doing this presentation, Louise and Jerry. That was super informative. I learned a lot. So thank you so much. Just let me check.
Well, hopefully we'll be able to see some of you folks at competitions and be able to meet face to face.
There was one additional question. Sure. About if you're at a meet and the call sheet doesn't have an athlete's designation, is it okay to ask them?
Somebody in the organizing committee will know what their designation is. But yeah, if you can't get that in, I mean, you need to know that ahead of time before you get out on field to play, because you need to be ascertaining how many minutes they're going to take. How do they need the assistant? You need to find that out well ahead of being out on field to play and asking the athlete. But in essence, yeah, you can ask them.
And there should, I mean, Canada has a national classification team. You don't have to be internationally classed unless you're at that level of event. I mean, I live in Denver and work here in the United States, and we have the same situation. A lot of times, especially youth, they don't have an adequate classification. So sometimes we guess and have the classifiers watch them throw. And then the national classifiers will give us a better opinion on what the class they should be in.
Yeah, the only thing is sometimes in Canada, we use high tech and sometimes struggle getting that information printed on the sheets, but we're making progress. It will come.
Yeah, true. Yeah, documentation, simple things like what implement should they throw? You saw, we showed you a chart, and we try to have the software be able to put that information next to every athlete, indicating what, say, are they throwing a 4 kilo or a 3 kilo shot put, et cetera, et cetera. That information should be there. And what's even more complicated is when they become youth, when they're youth, you have to take age into account. So that open division, here's the list of classifications versus what implement they should throw, you have to add age into it. But that's all laid out on a chart. You have a good team that kind of sets up the pits and provides that information to you, things will work.
Okay, thank you very much for this, Louise and Jerry, and thank you, everyone. There is a evaluation form that Bill sent out, so if you could please fill that out and send it back to Bill, that would be great. And thank you for your time.
Oh, thanks, everybody. Thanks for your attention. Appreciate it. Thanks, Louise.
Thank you, Jerry.